explain why. Let me read, because people I don't think understand post-traumatic stress disorder, so this is going to be kind of a long video, because I'm going to read the criteria out of the handy-dandy DSM-5, the Bible of all counselors. So, at least it should be. Okay, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, post-traumatic, post meaning after, traumatic meaning it was trauma, it was something horrible. Stress, you're not, disorder, you're not dealing with it, okay? Complex post-traumatic stress disorder is when the abuse or the traumatic event continues and 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 continues, with the extra added bonus of the person generally, not always, but generally doing the continuing abuse or the continuing drama is somebody you loved and trusted. A parent, a spouse, a sibling, whatever. So it's complex, meaning it's happening over and over and over again, and in some cases it is because it is being perpetrated by somebody that you're supposed to love and trust. So a little bit of betrayal going on as far as that is concerned. Okay, so let's read the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, post-traumatic stress disorder. The following criteria apply to adults, adolescents, and children older than 6 years old. A. Now there's A through H, so in each one you're going to need to meet the criteria, one or more in each one. So A, exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. 1, directly experiencing traumatic events. 2, witnessing in person the events as it occurred to others. So, for example, seeing a traffic accident or a murder or something like that. 3, learning that the traumatic events occurred to a close family member or close friend. In cases of actual or threatened death of a family member or friend, the events must have been violent or accidental. 4, experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic events. For example, first responders collecting human remains, police officers repeatedly exposed to details of child abuse. Note, in criterion A4, this does not apply to the exposure through electronic media, television, movies, or pictures, unless this exposure is work-related. In other words, if it is voluntary, if you are going and you are watching stuff on YouTube, or you are watching stuff on Netflix, or you are watching stuff on television, or you go to the movies and you watch a really traumatic, one of those awful, horrible Saw movies, ew, then you're doing it to yourself. It's voluntary, because you're not being forced to. It's not like you're being forced to watch this stuff. So that is the criterion for that. Also, in criterion A, let me go over to the diagnostic features. The directly experienced traumatic events in criterion A include, but are not limited to, exposure to war as a combatant, a civilian, threatened or actual physical assault, physical attack, robbery, mugging, childhood physical abuse, threatened or actual sexual violence, for example, forced sexual penetration, alcohol or drug-facilitated sexual penetration, abusive sexual contact, non-contact sexual abuse, sexual trafficking, being kidnapped, being taken hostage, terrorist attack, torture, incarceration as a prisoner of war, natural or human man-made disasters, and severe motor vehicle accidents. So it's not limited to that, but that's just some of the things that it covers. Okay, so you only need to meet one or more of that in criterion A. Criterion B, presence of one or more of the following intrusion symptoms associated with traumatic events beginning after the traumatic event occurred. So intrusion, meaning it's happening, you have no control over it, it just pops up in your head. 1, recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories of the traumatic event. 2, recurrent distressing dreams in which the content and or effect of the dream are related to the traumatic event. So night terrors, constantly nightmares, dreaming, redreaming, reliving, re-seeing, re-happening in your head at night dreams. 3, dissociative reactions. Dissociative, meaning it's happening, you're not in the present moment, the lights are on and the engines are running, but you're not here, you're back where the event happened. So, for example, flashbacks in which the individual feels or acts as if the traumatic events were reoccurring. Such reactions may occur on a continuum, with the most extreme being a complete loss of awareness of the present surroundings. So in other words, something can trigger you, a smell, a sight, a sound, a person, a place, a thing, and all of a sudden, boom, you are right back to when the trauma happened, and you're like, having a panic attack because it feels real, it feels like it's happening or it's going to happen, and that's That's a flashback. Okay. Dissociative. Okay. Number 4, intense or prolonged psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic events. Triggers, things that make you think about it. Person, place, thing, smells, feelings, thoughts, etc. 5, marked physiological reactions to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic events. Panic attack. So the trigger happens, and the next thing you know, your heart is racing, you're racing thoughts, you can't breathe, you're having a panic attack. That's a physiological reaction. All right, criterion 3, or C, persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the traumatic events beginning after the traumatic events occurred, as evidenced by one or more of the following. 1, avoidance of or efforts to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, feelings about or closely associated with traumatic events. So in other words, I don't want to think about it, I'm not going to think about it, I'm not going to think about it, I don't want to think about it, I don't want to think about it. What am I thinking about the whole time? But you're trying hard not to think about it. Avoidance, number 2, avoidance or efforts to avoid external reminders, people, places, conversations, activities, objects, and situations that arouse distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about or closely associated with the event. So some people, okay, let's say that you're in an airplane accident. Okay, you're probably going to, if you have PTSD, you're going to avoid the airports, you're probably going to avoid flying on a plane, you're probably going to take the bus everywhere, because that reminds you of being in that accident. So, all right, that was C. D, negative alterations in cognitions, the way you think, and mood associated with the traumatic events, beginning or worsening after the traumatic event occurred, as evidenced by 2 or more of the following. 1, an inability to remember important aspects of the trauma event, typically due to dissociative amnesia and not due to other factors such as head injury, drugs, or alcohol. So, in other words, when somebody has been through, and remember, I'm relating this back to abuse. So when somebody has been through a domestic violence situation, when somebody has been abused by an abuser, we have a tendency to not remember aspects of that abuse. We have abuse amnesia because it's too traumatic. We can't cope. So that is what they are talking about. Now, in cases where something physical has happened, you'll forget major portions, like, for example, you're in an accident, you're going to forget a large portion, if you have PTSD, of that accident. And some people get PTSD and some people don't. And I don't know why, but some people are prone to it and some people are not. Some people can just, be firefighters and see horrible things and they're okay, and other people can be firefighters and see horrible things and end up on my couch. So, yeah, rhyme or reason, nature, nurture, who knows? They're doing more studies on that. So I'm going to be really interested to see what they come up with as these studies come out. Okay, number 2, persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself, others, or the world. For example, I am bad. No one can be trusted. The world is completely dangerous. My whole nervous system is permanently ruined. Or one of the ones that I hear a lot is, I'm damaged goods. Ouch. So that is a mistaken belief. That is a mistaken thought. And that's where cognitive behavioral therapy comes in. So you work on those mistaken thoughts and those mistaken beliefs so that you get those out of your head because they're not true. All right, 3, persistent distorted cognitions, thinking about the cause or consequence of the traumatic events that lead the individual to blame themselves. It's all my fault. It's all my fault. I should have, I could have, I would have. If only I'd done this, if only I'd done that, I could have prevented this, I could have prevented that, they could have loved me, da 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 da. Do you see what I'm saying? That too is mistaken thoughts, mistaken beliefs, which will need to be worked on with cognitive behavioral therapy. All right, Number 4, persistent negative emotional state, fear, horror, anger, guilt, or shame. Interesting. A lot of people coming out of abusive relationships are just riddled with guilt and shame. So, and also people witnessing horrible events riddled with guilt and shame. I should have stopped that. I could have stopped that. Why didn't I stop that? What happened? Da 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 da. Again, mistaken thoughts, mistaken beliefs, that'll need to be worked on. Okay. Number 5, markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities. So things you used to enjoy, you don't anymore. You don't do it. 6, feelings of detachment and estrangement for others, kind of isolating. 7, persistent inability to experience positive emotions, inability to experience happiness, satisfaction, or loving feelings. You kind of feel numb. So when you're having PTSD, you really do kind of feel numb. So that's what that's talking about. Okay. E. Marked alterations in arousal and reactivity associated with the traumatic events, beginning or worsening after the traumatic events occurred, as evidenced by 2 or more of the following. Number 1, irritable behavior and angry outbursts with little or no provocation, typically expressed as verbal or physical aggression towards people or objects. Yeah, hair trigger. Absolutely, hair trigger. It's common that once you have come out of an abusive relationship that your emotions are going to be raw, and one of the easiest ones to access is anger, because it's part of the fight, flight, or freeze thing. So yeah, anger is generally one of the ones that we access, but you got to remember, anger is not a pure emotion. It is always, there's something underneath driving it, either fear or hurt or fear of being hurt or something like that. So you got to figure out what is going on underneath that anger. Why are you so hair triggered? What's happening? All right. 2, reckless or destructive self-destructive behavior. Okay, you start drinking. You start driving recklessly. You're a diabetic and you eat entire bags of candy. That's one of the signs and symptoms. It's like you cannot do that. It's like you're starting to self-destruct because you're not working on the stuff that's actually going on. Okay, hypervigilance. Constantly, what's around, who's around, who's thinking, who's talking, who's doing, a little almost paranoid, hypervigilance, like, ooh, okay, I gotta be on guard, gotta make sure I'm safe, that kind of thing. Exaggerated startle response, so you hear loud noise. This mostly happens with people that have been victim of physical violence or have been in a war situation. Hear a loud noise, you hit the deck, which makes total sense to me. Problems with concentration. Again, you could sit there and read a chapter in a book and you realize 2 hours later you've read the same chapter over and over and over again. Yeah, trouble with concentration. Sleep disturbance, difficulty falling or staying asleep or restless sleep. That is common in PTSD coming out of an abusive relationship, because oftentimes the abusers have set it up so that we don't get a full night's sleep, and we're constantly on edge, and we're constantly, when's the next shoe going to drop? And so it's hard to get sleep. So, all right, that was E. F, the duration of the criteria B, C, D, and E is more than 1 month. So this has to go on for more than 1 month. G, the disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So, in other words, because you're isolating, because you have such a strong startle response, because you're hair trigger anger, you're having a difficult time holding a job, you're having a difficult time relating to family members, you're having a difficult time keeping friends, etc., etc., etc. Okay, that is G. H, the disturbance is not attributable to the physiological effects of substance abuse, medication or alcohol, or other medical condition. Okay. Then there's specifiers. So with dissociative symptoms. So the individual's symptoms meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, and in addition, in response to the stressor, the individual experiences persistent or reoccurring symptoms of either of the following. 1, depersonalization. Persistent or recurrent experiences of feeling detached and as if one was an outside observer. One's mental process or body. For example, feeling as though one were in a dream, feeling a sense of unreality of self or body or of time moving very slowly. So oftentimes what I will hear is people will tell me that they are watching themselves, like they're standing outside, almost like an out-of-body experience. They're standing outside of themselves and they're observing themselves. That's common. That is common, and that's a dissociative symptom. And that's, frankly, that's how we survive abuse, is that we separate ourselves from our body and we watch whatever is happening happen to us. And we tend to take that with us into recovery because that's what we've done to keep ourselves safe. It's completely subconscious. So, all right, derealization. This is the second one. Persistent or recurrent experiences of unreality of surroundings. The world around the individual is experienced as unreal, dreamlike, distant, or distorted. These cannot be the result of substance abuse, such as blackouts from alcohol intoxication or other medical condition, complex seizures, etc. Okay, so that is post-traumatic stress disorder. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder is when it happens over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, with the extra added bonus of the person who is doing it is someone that we loved and trusted, so there's the betrayal. So one of the questions that we got was trauma bonding. Can you talk more about trauma bonding and how to heal from that?
I learned about trauma bonding not through mainstream psychology. I was looking up, this is back in 2009 when I was still teaching self-defense, and the Kris Rihanna case came up. And I was watching CNN or something like that, and there was a woman who ran a ton of women's shelters across the US. And the interviewer just asked her a straightforward question, which is, why do women who are violently assaulted keep getting back with their abusers? And she really didn't have an answer. And I was like, that's a shame. There must be an answer. So I started doing my own research, and I came across a group of people who specifically focused on getting people out of cults. And they weren't really psychologists, they were Christian counselors. And they were talking about trauma bonding and the effects of trauma bonding in satanic cults. Trauma bonding in that environment seemed very relevant to the cycle of abuse that women in domestic violence situations would go through. In a cult environment, you would take a child, you would abuse the child, and then abandon the child, maybe lock him or her in a cupboard, so they're frightened and they're abused and they're alone. And then you come hours later and you rescue them in inverted commas, from the abuse that you put them through. Over time, the mind starts to develop what Freud would have called a fetishist split, where the child knows that you're the same person but can't live with the reality that you're the same person, so they split you into two, angel and demon. The bond is created through the pain, through the trauma. So very intense pain because of, like you were saying last night about the amygdala isn't that smart. Parts of our brain aren't that clever at distinguishing between good and bad stimuli. We don't necessarily always know what's good for us and what is the healthiest thing for us. And that pain pushes very deep into the neural pathways, it seems. And that's literally the trauma bond is like a connection that is created through pain and suffering.
So how do you break that?
You have to recognize it for what it is. When you're trauma bonded to an abuser, you need to stop in your own mind and in your dialogue with your therapist, stop using the word love and only use the word addiction. Start talking about...
That's what I said last night.
Stop talking about them as your ex. Just focus on them as being an abuser, and take them out of that space in your head and in your heart, which is reserved for a loving relationship. That's not where they belong, so they shouldn't be there. So we have to, by taking them out of there verbally, because your verbal dialogue is a direct reflection of your unconscious map of reality, you start taking them out of that part of your unconscious map. So that's not your lover, that's not your spouse. It's a kidnapper, it's an abuser, it's a torturer, it's a different thing. So that will start to help the client gather the leverage to pull their feelings back from the abuser, to realize that their feelings are false feelings. It's a kind of addiction, it's a hijacking of the amygdala.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. What do you think of the... Trauma bond is addiction, not love. Absolutely. And it is an addiction. And it actually lights up the same areas of the brain that doing heroin does, or meth, or coke, or alcohol, or anything else. So you do have to treat it as if you are addicted. So when you are leaving an abusive relationship, you absolutely must treat it like an addiction. And honestly, almost like working the 12 steps is honestly going to help you. I know that sounds crazy because it's like, well, but I wasn't using a substance. Well, but yes, you were. Because your brain was on dopamines, endorphins, neuroepinephrine, serotonin, all the feel-good chemicals, the oxytocin, all of that stuff. You've got to get over that addiction to that feeling, that high, that low, that high, that low, that high, that low. So the other question was, you said dolphining, dolphining. So getting out of a relationship that's abusive and then just going, bam, right back into
dolphins, cresting out the water and straight back in. Dolphining as a form of narcissistic addiction. Well, if you are an addict and you lose one source of heroin or one source of meth, you're going to go and find another one. Part of what pushes us into that I think it's important to say at this point is the emotional flashbacks and is an inability to deal with the pain. Obviously, if I'm going to go cold turkey, there's going to be pain. If I have CPTSD, my capacity to deal with that pain might be diminished. My resilience might be very, very low. So we have to look at that and say, okay, well, are you suffering from a kind of, let's call it painophobia or discomfortophobia, where you cannot tolerate the discomfort of the separation for the length of time it will take for you to heal? Like you said last night, could be a year, could be three, and maybe we should be talking about giving people the idea of, at least as a guideline in their minds, of 365 days, like a 365-day cleanse. The illness is in the area of your system related to love and to sexuality and to intimacy. So maybe a little cleanse, a little diet that lasts a year would be a sensible marker. I can't really see how anybody can be in a truly narcissistically abusive relationship and be healed enough to be ready to get into a new relationship in anything less than a year.
I agree. I totally agree. And part of that reason is just what you was talking about, is that you are so used to loving them, you've got to stop thinking them as a love interest. You've got to stop thinking, it's just like an addict going, man, I really miss tequila. Boy, do I know that one. So, it's like, because I'm a recovering alcoholic. So, yeah, it's like you got to stop talking about the substance as if it was something that was good for you. It's not. If they have forced you away from family and friends, if they lie to you, if they're causing you to do things that are hinky, if you're, doing things that you would not otherwise do, these people are not good for you, guys. These are just as bad as heroin or meth. They really are. Finding the line between self-care and facing pain, as in avoiding triggers or dealing with them head on. Oh, geez. Okay, let me take this one first and you answer your. So from a therapist perspective, dealing with CPTSD is walking a fine line. So there's a wonderful book called CPTSD, From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker. Tell all of my clients is you're going to get triggered like nobody's fucking business. So you read tiny little bits and then you walk away and you go take care of yourself. So you take it in tiny chunks and then you walk away and take care of yourself and then you come back. So that's the trick with PTSD or CPTSD, is that yes, you're going to get triggered. Yes, you're going to feel pain. Yes, it's not going to feel good, but no, you cannot stop. You must take breaks, you must do self-care and then come right back to it and then confront it as much as you can and then take a break and then come back to it. So Richie, what do you think?
I think I would be worried for a client who saw a distinction between pain and self-care, as though they are at two different ends of the polarity. Self-care is frequently uncomfortable, annoying, and painful. Getting up and going for a jog is a pain in the arse, sometimes quite literally, if you don't warm your glutes up.
Right.
So it's not, they're not two different things. Please don't fall prey to this poisonous and dangerous mindset that I must not be in pain, like that I can never experience discomfort. All life is suffering, said the Buddha. So it's going to suck at times, but don't be a masochist. Obviously, that goes without saying. Shouldn't have to make that point, but I find that I do with my clients, because people with CPTSD tend to see things in black and white, and they like to polarize issues. Self-care at times, and probably most of the time, will be moderating of discomfort. Self-care is also pushing the self to thrive. Pushing the self involves pushing outside of the comfort zone. And that should be a daily struggle. It should be something you're looking to do on a daily basis. If you're just looking to numb out and not feel pain, it's not self-care.
Totally agree.
So the first thing that I should say is complex PTSD is a new concept to me. I certainly can't pretend to be an expert in this. I'm very interested in it. I think it's the answer that a lot of us have been looking for a long time. I think it represents a revolutionary moment in psychotherapy, the concept of complex PTSD. And it says a lot that many people don't know about it, and that it's not officially recognized as yet. If you haven't yet, you should get the book by Pete Walker, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. It's a landmark, game-changing book for people who were raised in adverse childhood environments and who suffer from people-pleaser syndrome, codependency, that type of thing. If you want to understand why, any psychological problem you can think of is dealt with in the model that Pete Walker presents of complex PTSD and the 4 F's for the trauma style responses. I won't get into that here. I want to talk today particularly about complex PTSD and covert narcissism. So let's deal. So can a young adult develop complex PTSD? Absolutely. It isn't always down to the parents. It isn't always down to the childhood environment. It often is. You could even go so far as to say it usually is. If you look at the model of what complex PTSD represents, it's highly likely that you're talking about childhood abuse and a relationship with parents or parental style authority figures who hold the most power in terms of patterning the unconscious of the child's mind at that moment. So absolutely you can develop it at any age. The example that is often given in complex PTSD land, if you're interested in the research that goes on, is that of political prisoners. If you're put in an environment where you're infantilized, entrapped and cannot escape, and you're put back in a state of vulnerability and helplessness where you're dependent, you're forced to be a dependent upon the goodwill, kindness, or sort of care of others, like being a prisoner, then you can develop complex PTSD. There are certain things that are important to the development of complex PTSD. One of them is not that you must be a child. The fact that you're a child is an incidental factor in creating complex PTSD. You must be a dependent. You must not be able to escape, and you must feel or experience subjectively as though your very survival depends on the behavior, on the decisions of the person who is effectively looking after you, or if you were trapped and shoved in a dungeon, at least the gatekeeper, the tower keeper, the guy who jangles the keys that lock the door. His moods, her moods, what she wants, what she desires will become a large focus of your life when your life is shrunk down to this environment, which can have frequently has a cult-like quality to it. So there is a body of research out there.
Now, let's talk about emotional flashbacks or flashbacks. When somebody has been abused or when somebody has been traumatized. So, remember, PTSD, it's a one-time event. You've seen it. It's happened. It's over. You've seen somebody get hurt, a train wreck, a car accident, a war, that kind of thing. CPTSD is constant, repeated. Prisoner of war. They're constantly being tortured. Abuse. They're constantly being tortured. So when somebody has been subjected to trauma or traumas, repeated, flashbacks are common. And why? Because the person is getting triggered. So a trigger can be anything. It can be a sight, seeing something. It can be a smell. It can be a taste. It can be, a song. It can be a place. It can be a person. It can be a voice. It can be arguing. It can be anything, really. Anything that reminds you of the trauma or the abuse. So when somebody gets triggered, what happens is their brain, it's like their body's here in the present, but their little brain decides to disassociate and go into the past. And so they are reliving the event, and it's like a movie being played over in their head, and they're seeing it happen as if it was happening right here, right now, or they disassociate and they go into a panic attack. And it's a flashback, and it's traumatic, and they're doing this because something triggered them to remind them of the abuse, and they're freaking out. The best example of that I can give is, say somebody was in a car accident and they're terrified of driving the car now because they were in a car accident. Okay, great. You desensitize them. So you start by looking at a picture of the car, or a car that looked like the car that they were in when they were in the accident. And then at some point, you're going to have them walk out to the parking lot. Then you're going to have them touch the car. Then you're going to have them sit in the passenger side as they talk about the accident. Then you're going to have them sit in the driver's seat as they talk about the accident. So that's desensitization therapy. So that's one way of dealing with flashbacks. Okay, just one way. Yeah, flashbacks are real. Flashbacks happen. They can either be full-blown, where the person is, lights are on, engine's running, and they are completely in the past watching the trauma happen. Or it can be, they're here, but they're having a panic attack because they're remembering what it felt like when they were abused or when they were subjected to that trauma. So that is that. So how to help. Read up all you can. Educate yourself as much as you can on PTSD. So when somebody is disassociating or, kind of lights are on, engines running, you want to touch them. You want to pat their hand. Hello, where'd you go? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are you seeing right now? You are in the here and now. You are with me here in this office. Everything is okay. You're safe. You're okay. Hello, where did you go? You want to get them back in their body. Because generally when somebody's having a flashback, they're disassociating, it's like they're floating outside their body. You want to bring them back to the here and the now. And that's, you got to do it gently, but you got to do it firmly. So, yeah, you kind of touch them, rub their hand. Hello, where'd you go? What's happening? What's going on? That kind of thing. So, flashbacks are real. Educate yourself on PTSD, see PTSD, read as much as you can to help them. And validate. Where did you go? Okay, so you went back to where the trauma was. So what was the trigger that happened right before the trauma happened? What reminded you of that? What was the trigger that reminded you of the trauma that you went into a flashback? What was that? What was the trigger? And you get them to talk about it. So it's a fine line of discussing the trauma, talking about the trauma, but not overwhelming them to the point where they are, having flashbacks or disassociating. It's kind of like walking up to it, talking about it, and backing off, and then walking up and talking about it, and backing off. And it takes a long time. So people with PTSD are not going to talk about their trauma willingly, obviously, because it was traumatic, and it's frightening. And there's been so many panic attacks or so many episodes of disassociating that they don't want to talk about it, and I don't blame them. But they must. In order to heal, they've got to be able to cope with what happened to them. So it's a process. It's a process. So read as much as you can. Educate yourself as much as you can. Be gentle, be kind. Bring them back to the present. Validate.
Papa kahonua
poco que